Good afternoon, everyone.
Perfect. We can hear you now.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to test to make sure everyone can hear.
It was that week off, Anthony. We took 1 week off and this happened.
Well, we are so sorry for the delays, everyone, but good afternoon and welcome to the Supply Chain Solutions Weekly Ship Show. Today is June 23rd, 2022, and this is episode number 24 in our weekly educational series that keeps you informed of the changing market conditions as we work to bring order to a chaotic global supply chain in an ever-changing geopolitical world. And as always, it's my pleasure to welcome our amazing Director of Marketing, Vanessa Fry, who produces our show each week. And finally, my name is Anthony D'Ambrosio. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Supply Chain Solutions, the company that always delivers value quickly, affordably, and flawlessly. So this week's, folks, we have a great subject, and I think it's going to garner a lot of interest, and there's a lot of buzz about it. We're going to talk about the Ocean Shipping Reform Act and what you need to be aware of. But before we jump into it, just let us take a few seconds to just remember all of the people in Ukraine as they struggle for their freedom. Thank you, everyone. So, as you all know, President Biden on June 16th signed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022 into law. And this is the first significant change and the largest overhaul of the shipping regulations since 1998. Now, the legislation broadens the regulatory powers of the Federal Maritime Commission with the goal of promoting U.S. exports while reining in ocean carrier market power that has strengthened over the last 25 years, primarily through the rise of vessel alliances. And as everyone knows, many of the container ship cartel have been forming alliances over the past 10 years and consolidating. And this is where we're at currently. And in a nutshell, this bill really revises the requirements governing ocean shipping to increase the authority of the Federal Maritime Commission to promote the growth and development of U.S. exports through an ocean transportation system that is competitive, efficient, and economical. Now, for example, the bill requires the FMC to do three particular things: investigate complaints about detention and demurrage charges. For example, late fees is just one of those things charged by common carriers, okay? And the second thing is to determine whether those charges are reasonable. And lastly, if they are deemed unreasonable, to order refunds for unreasonable charges. Now, the legislation prohibits common carriers, marine terminal operators, or ocean transportation intermediaries from refusing cargo space unreasonably when available, or resorting to other unfair or unjustly discriminatory practices or methods. So let me try to provide a high-level overview of what's in it and why it matters. So I'm going to take it step by step. There's several components. The first one is really one of the main ones, which is the demurrage and the detention rulemaking. So just to give you a quick summary, the FMC shall initiate rulemaking further defining prohibited practices by common carriers, marine terminal operators, shippers, and ocean transportation intermediaries regarding the assessment of demurrage or detention. And this is the actual legislation. Okay, so they want to initiate this rulemaking. So here's why it matters. The rulemaking, which the FMC actually already initiated, puts teeth into the FMC's interpretative rule on demurrage and detention, which shippers have alleged have not been adhered to by the carriers. And they actually put a deadline in place. And not later than 45 days after the date of enactment. And when they say enactment, they mean the process of passing the legislation, which, as we all know, has just passed on June 20th. And so for this particular component of the OSRA, the deadline is no later than 45 days after they pass this legislation on June 20th. So 45 days from June 20th, there should be some sort of final ruling and implementation on this particular component of the OSRA. Now, moving on to the next one of the other things that are going to be changing are the unfair discriminatory methods of rulemaking. So let me give you a summary of that. The FMC shall initiate a rulemaking defining unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods used by carriers against their customers. And again, here's why it matters. The provision seeks to address complaints of carrier service discrimination by exporters and small shippers. And I can tell you right now, our operations team runs into this on a weekly basis, particularly on the export side of things, when we want to book an export LCL or FCL shipment. And oftentimes carriers will not always take an export shipment, or they won't even work with some smaller shippers, whether you're a direct importer or you're just a small freight forwarding company, because they want to work with those higher volume companies, higher revenue. They want to book that higher revenue freight. Now, the deadline for this particular component of the OSRA would be not later than 60 days after the date of enactment, or essentially having been signed into legislation, with a final rule not later than 1 year after enactment, or in other words, passing into legislation. So pay really close attention, folks, to these deadlines. Okay, people think that just because this legislation has been signed into law, that it's going to take effect immediately. And as we go through this, you'll see that some of these things being initiated could take up to 2 to 3 years to be implemented. This is why when many clients have contacted me and friends in the business, I wasn't real bullish about what's happening here with the OSRA, but we'll have to see how this plays out. Now, one of the other components of the OSRA is the rulemaking on refusing to deal. Okay, so the summary is this: that the FMC, consulting with the U.S. Coast Guard, shall initiate a rulemaking defining unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space. So here's why it matters. When it's related to unfair or discriminatory methods rulemaking, this provision addresses shipper complaints of carriers ignoring customers they deem unprofitable to their operations. So let's give you an example about that. So when we were having global supply chain meltdown, freight Armageddon this time last year, all of us have contracts with various container ship lines, all of the logistics companies around the United States and around the world. And sometimes those contracts weren't worth the paper that they were printed on, because even though we may have had a contact rate of, say, 10,000 for a 40-foot container from Hong Kong to LA, carriers wanted to, again, book higher revenue freight. It was almost like going into a bidding war. And if somebody else would want to pay 13,000, they would book it. And so this is a little bit of a play on that particular aspect of this component of the rulemaking on refusing to deal or ignoring customers that they deemed unprofitable to their operation. As we move on, one of the other components of the OSRA is the shipping exchange registry. Okay, so the summary is this: that the FMC shall issue regulations that set standards for registered national shipping agencies. And again, the way I've set this up is I'll give you a summary, I'll tell you what it is, tell you what the change is, and then why it matters. And why it matters is this: is that a shipping exchange platform, sort of a digital over-the-counter or otherwise sort of a platform, is going to be able to connect shippers and carriers for the purpose of entering into underlying transportation contracts, and it will not operate without first being registered with the FMC. So for all of these folks that are part of these shipping, for example, we have a lot of clients up in New York, up in Manhattan, that are part of a clothing and garment sort of a association, okay? And a lot of these people become members, they pay a fee, and then they get some preferential rates, and they're able to go online to their platform and exchange pricing and book shipments through a platform. Well, many of these associations are not registered with the FMC. So now folks will no longer be able to do that once this is implemented, unless that association becomes registered with the Federal Maritime Commission. And so the deadline for this is not later than 3 years after the enactment. Now, this is important. Now, think about that, not later than 3 years. So they signed legislation into law on June 20th, but it could take 3 years for this particular component of the OSRA to take effect. So again, this is one of the reasons why I have my doubts about the legislation, but that's just my personal opinion. Now, one of the other important components that I think everyone should take note of is the street dwell time statistics, okay? And the summary is this: the Office of Management and Budget shall approve an information collection and publication of street dwell time for containers. And the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, will also publish statistics relating to the dwell times used in intermodal transportation at the top 25 ports, including inland ports, which is subject to getting the proper appropriations funding. Okay, so why it matters is that street dwell times are linked to extremely high shipper detention costs, and are really a major factor in causing port and supply chain congestion. And again, the deadline for this is not later than 60 days after the enactment or signing into legislation. Essentially, they really have to approve information collection no later than 240 days after being signed into legislation. And so we've got this OSRA. They put this particular change into the Shipping Act, okay? And they want to start to enforce it 60 days after signing it into legislation. But when it comes to, gathering that data collection, they have up to 240 days, okay, to put these this particular statistics and platform together. And if they don't complete the objective for publishing these dwell time statistics, then the provision expires by December 31st, 2026. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Here's another component to the OSRA, which is enhancing the FMC's investigative capacity. Okay,
Anthony, we lost your audio. Bear with us for a second. Anthony's having some issues today on his end with the audio. He'll take care of it in a second. We cannot hear you. I'm not sure if your phone disconnected. One quick second, everyone. That's funny, Christy. Anthony, do you want to try to get out and back in? See if that works, or join again with the device you were using for the microphone? Take your time.
I'll try that if you can hear me.
Perfect. Yep, we can
Okay.
hear you.
So sorry, guys. We're having some bad thunderstorms here in the Philadelphia, New Jersey area where I'm located. But let's talk about that next component, which is enhancing the FMC's investigation capacity. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with the BOE, the Bureau of Enforcement. Okay, that's the regulatory arm for the Federal Maritime Commission. So essentially, the summary is like this. The FMC chairperson shall staff within 5 of the agency's divisions, not fewer than 7 total positions to assist in investigations and oversight, in addition to the positions already within those divisions on the date of enactment or signing into legislation. So they essentially want to hire more investigators. And why it matters is because they're going to have new oversight authority that will require higher staffing levels. Okay, so they're going to need more inspectors to, investigate all these things and initiate enforcement. And that deadline is not later than 18 months after being signed into legislation. So again, it's going to take them 18 months. They have 18 months to enact this particular component. Okay, so again, it's going to take some time. Now let's move into one of the other components, which is the emergency authority to address supply chain congestion. Okay, so the FMC shall issue an information request seeking public comment as to whether supply chain congestion has created an emergency situation of a magnitude to cause substantial adverse effects on the competitiveness and the reliability of international ocean transportation and the supply system, and whether that temporary emergency order would alleviate it. So an emergency order could include requiring ocean carriers or marine terminals to share directly with shippers, railroads, and motor carriers information relating to cargo throughput and availability to ensure efficient transportation, loading and unloading of cargo. And right now, folks, most of the marine terminal operators around the country do not share this type of information, and our staff has to work extremely hard with our boots on the ground to essentially make sure we are keeping our finger on the pulse of what's going on in each port around the country and around the globe for that matter. But why it matters is because the government's emergency orders are considered a last resort in dealing with transportation issues. And again, this has a deadline of not later than 60 days after being signed into legislation, which we all know, as I've said several times, has been signed into law on June 20th. And these emergency orders will remain in effect no longer than 60 days. So when the government or the Federal Maritime Commission is going to issue, an emergency directive like this, that directive can only stay in place 60 days, okay, unless there's a mitigating circumstance. So here's another really good one that's part of the OSRA, which is the chassis pool best practices. And the summary goes like this. The FMC shall enter into an agreement with the Transportation Research Board under the TRB, Transportation Research Board, and they shall carry out a study and develop best practices for on-terminal or near-terminal chassis pools to provide service to marine terminal operators, motor carriers, railroads, and other stakeholders that use the chassis pools with the goal of optimizing supply chain efficiency and effectiveness. And as everyone knows, the container ship lines do not provide chassis anymore, okay? So that change happened several years ago before the pandemic. And why it matters is because intermodal companies, shippers, and ocean carriers dispute the way chassis pools operate. And now the government is looking to shed more light on how to make them more efficient. And this would actually be a really great one, because I can't tell you the kind of issues we have with chassis and chassis pools and picking up chassis and securing them and returning them. So it's just a real mess. And this deadline should take effect no later than April 1st, 2023. And, you know, if they complete this study by April 1st, 2023, and then they want to form an agreement, that agreement has to be implemented no later than April 1st, 2024. And they have to make the publication of best practices available on the FMC website. So we're going to have to see how that all plays out. And another one that, another change to the OSRA is the CDL, the commercial driver's license testing, okay? And the summary again goes like this. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration shall conduct a review of the discretionary waiver authority described in the FMCSA's August 31st, 2021 order that states concerning third-party CDL skill test examiners in response to the COVID-19 emergency. And there were a lot of changes because of the shortage of drivers when the pandemic, you know, unfolded, as in terms of how they test for CDL licensing. And why it matters is that there has been a concern that allowing states to conduct third-party skills testing with the goal of making it more efficient to certify truck drivers can reduce safety. So they're essentially saying that some of the states might not have such a stringent program, and they will sort of lower the bar on the testing, if I may put it that way. And that deadline is actually 90 days after the date of enactment. So if the FMCSA finds no safety concerns after the review, the agency is going to revise motor carrier regulations 90 days after the review is completed to make discretionary waiver authority permanent. So that's something that requires us to really take a look at. And we only have a few more of these changes to the OSRA as we wind down. Let's talk about and this is a big one, the review of potential discrimination on hazardous material transport. Okay, so again, the summary goes like this. The U.S. Comptroller General shall initiate a review of whether there have been any systemic decisions by ocean carriers to discriminate against transporting hazardous materials by denning vessel space or equipment. And again, here's why it matters, folks. Some shippers of cargo that qualify as hazardous materials have complained that they have been unreasonably denied vessel space as demand for capacity has increased over the last 2 years. And I can tell you this, folks, I'm the senior hazardous material specialist for Supply Chain Solutions, and I've been certified in every form of hazardous material for 28 years. And many times we try to book hazardous material full containers or even less than container load shipments. And you know, during the pandemic and as it unfolded, many carriers did not want to take specific types of hazardous material, whether it was a toxic or a corrosive or a flammable liquid. And on the flip side, even though the air portion has nothing to do with this, it's sort of like on the air freight side where, you know, a lot of air freight carriers don't want to carry a lot of battery shipments because there's this myth that it interferes with the avionics on the aircraft. And as long as it's packaged properly, in compliance with the regulations, it never interferes. And it's basically air carriers, but particularly now as we talk about ocean carriers, not wanting to carry that hazardous material because they can, load other dry cargo or out of gauge cargo or project cargo that is much more higher in revenue generating for them. So this deadline, again, is 90 days after the date of enactment. And then as we wind down, just a couple of more. One of the other changes to the OSRA, and this is a long bill, folks, this is long legislation, using inland ports to store and transfer containers. So everyone should pay close attention to this one. The summary goes like this: the U.S. Department of Transportation, consulting with the U.S. Maritime Administration and the FMC, shall convene a meeting of representatives of ports, export terminals, ocean carriers, railroads, and trucking companies, and port labor to discuss strategies for identifying and storing and transferring cargo containers due to port congestion. Okay, and why it matters. With excess real estate within port areas as a premium or even non-existent, the focus is turning farther inland as they look for alternative storage space for containers. So that's a big one. We've all experienced these issues during the pandemic with the congestion being so bad that containers just being stacked. It's called container stacking, and being put in dead areas of the port, and then you don't get access for weeks. And at the same time, you're being charged detention and demurrage. Okay. And so that deadline is 90 days. And then finally, the last change to the OSRA is the report on adopting the adoption of technology at the ports. And this is a big one that sort of ties into the ILWU contract negotiations on the West Coast right now with the stevedores, because the summary goes like this: the Comptroller General shall submit to Congress a report describing the adoption of technology at U.S. ports as compared with foreign ports. And the report will consider general capabilities and assessments on whether technology at U.S. ports will lower cargo handling costs. Could they lower those cargo handling costs and bridge those regulatory barriers and the effect on labor? And so here's why it matters. Adopting technology, including higher levels of automation, is a major consideration by the freight industry in addressing increased demand for container capacity at U.S. ports. And right now, folks, there's a big pushback by the unions, by the stevedoring unions, the ILA, the ILWU, and many more, because they do not want to embrace the technology because it's going to affect their union membership and it's going to affect jobs. And there's a lot of money involved here. And this is what is slowing down the negotiations right now on the West Coast. So this particular change to the OSRA has a deadline of, it has to be squared away and packed up and ready to go no later than 1 year since the date of enactment. So I think, in closing, the Shipping Act aims to crack down on really unfair shipping practices by increasing the Federal Maritime Commission's regulatory oversight. And those who stand to benefit most are exporters, particularly on this last point, including companies that are exporting American farm goods, and ocean shipping carriers stand to lose. And critics say that the act may really hurt others as well. But really, at the heart of the act and the spark that led to its creation is detention and demurrage abuse. That's the big enchilada, folks. And demurrage refers to the fee an ocean carrier or sometimes a terminal operator charges when an importer does not pick up and remove a container from a terminal promptly after its arrival. And detention is charged when an exporter does not pick up an empty container and return it within a allotted time span. And really, experts say that the so-called detention and demurrage fees are reasonable in concept, but in practice are often abused. And the Federal Maritime Commission has found examples of exporters and importers being charged for non-compliance when it was impossible to comply. For example, an importer being charged for not picking up a container when the container was inaccessible on the ship. So, I mean, it's a sad situation how some of these things have been abused over the years. And the new law shifts the burden of proof to the carrier, which must prove its fees are reasonable. And under the law, the carrier must keep must keep track of detailed information on each container, including its number, location, and when it's first made available for pickup. And if the carrier can't provide the data, the importer or the exporter doesn't have to pay the fee. So if an exporter or importer believes it received an unfair fee, they can take their complaint to the Federal Maritime Commission or FMC, one and the same, which has 5 commissioners appointed by the President of the United States. And a lot of times people hesitated in doing that because they were afraid of retaliation by the carrier once the complaint was lodged. So finally, folks, the bottom line is this: though the law makes significant strides, changes won't all happen overnight. The bill directs the FMC to make some changes via a rulemaking process, which could take several months or even years. So we're just going to have to watch this closely and see how it unfolds. And then one last nugget on this before we turn it back over to Vanessa is our Executive Senior Vice President, Dennis Rolls, who's based in our New Jersey office, has a tremendous relationship with Commissioner Rebecca Dye. And we've recently reached out to her to see if she would, welcome being a guest on the weekly ship show. So please stay tuned for Vanessa's communications. Once we have confirmation, we hope to have Commissioner Dye on the ship show, and everyone will have an opportunity in an open forum to ask questions. And again, I want to apologize. We're getting some terrible storms here today. We're sorry for the technical difficulty. I know that the OSRA is a little complicated, so please feel free to reach out to me offline if you want to discuss it further. And with that, I'm going to send it back to the amazing Vanessa, who maybe has a couple questions.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I do have some thumbs up. Great show. Thank you for the info, and a question on if this will be recorded somewhere. Yes, it will. I will upload this to YouTube, and you all will receive a follow-up email tomorrow morning with the link to just review and watch it again. We know it's a lot of information. I do have one question for you here, Anthony, so far. So if anyone has any other questions, you can send over right now, or you can email Anthony. Question I have is, how enforced do you think these will truly be?
Well, I think we're really going to have to wait and see. I mean, we're talking about some big government regulatory agencies here, the marine terminal operators, the container ship lines. They have a lot of leverage, but the FMC is really expanding their Bureau of Enforcement, and they're going to be hiring all of these new investigators. And I really think that it's going to change how the FMC does their work. It's going to give them more authority to provide assistance to shippers. And I think that the commission itself, the Federal Maritime Commission, is going to be much more capable, robust, and it's going to be a much more active agency as a result of the legislation, and and the provisions in the OSRA. And I think that's really going to allow them to reach their goal. So we hope that it really does make a difference. We do see best intentions, but we're going to have to see how that works.
Thank you so much. I guess that's it for right now. Anthony's email is on the screen, so please reach out if you need any other information. And I do have something on the chat. Oh, well done. Another thumbs up. We're getting a lot of thumbs up today.
Thanks, guys. I know it was a long one, but make it a great day.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye now.
Next week.
Thank you, Vanessa.